teach us what it means to stand here representing you and your way. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. I want to start with just a word about the assignment that comes up after the reading week, the little essay on the Berman book. It's 1,000 words, no more than that, and then we're going to be discussing it in class. So it's a really simple assignment in that it's not a research project. The only thing you need to refer to is the Berman book itself. I would just suggest 3 questions to guide you. The first one is, what is the author's thesis? And a way to approach that might be simply to try to explain the title of the book, which he does, and he's a very good, clear writer, so it makes it easier to answer that question. But what is the main thesis? What's the main point the writer is trying to make? Secondly, how does Berman fill out that thesis? He explores a number of different parts of the Torah and addresses his thesis in that. And that would take up probably the bulk of your 1,000 words. 1,000 words is really not that much when you're trying to do that. And then finally, give some reflection on that, which can be any interaction with the book and its thesis. How, for example, you might say something about how this has changed your understanding, if it has, how it's useful for the church. Do you see it as something that will aid you in ministry? Any of those things are possible, but just something to show that you've thought beyond just chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3 has this content, right? And we'll be talking a lot about those implications in class that day when we come back from the reading week. So those 3 things, the first 2 will occupy the bulk of your 1,000 words, but just something on how this strikes you. If it changes your reading of the Old Testament, how, and so on. I think it's really an important book for people who are studying it for our purposes. It's possible to study the Old Testament from a kind of Marcionite point of view, in that you could read it as looking to critique it at every turn and to treat it like the new atheists do. That's possible, though I think a lot harder if you really get the fuller context, because most of those folks know almost nothing about the Bible itself. They're using caricatures of it. But you could come at it from a completely negative point of view, and that's not our purpose. And so the Berman book really helps us with that, I think, in some big ways. As does, I think, Genesis 1 through 11, and we get to that now. Enter into the content of the Old Testament itself, now that we've done a lot of preliminary things. So today we're going to be talking about Genesis 1 through 11. This block of material that is almost always in the treatment of Genesis and the Old Testament set aside as a separate body of material. It's sometimes called prehistory. It includes a series of stories and genealogies that introduce the origins of just about everything in human life. Human relationships, family, organization, sibling rivalry, crime and punishment, the dispersion of population across the earth, why everything is as it is, it seems to address. And so because it does address that and seem to explain that, many of the stories have the character of etiologies, as your textbook notes. That's just a fancy word for a story that explains something. And the ideology is usually recognized, by a little tagline that says, for this reason, we have this practice, or this is called this or that. And we'll see it many places in the Old Testament. Almost always, however, there is more to it than just explaining that thing in some kind of narrow way. Genesis 1 through 11 fits this label, though, prehistory in at least two ways. First, these chapters tell us about events and beginnings that we can't document historically. Despite what you may hear about the discovery of Noah's Ark by some archaeologists, we can't document any of this. You all know why Noah's Ark has been discovered. Actually, multiple arks, I think, have been discovered. I heard this story from a Harvard archaeologist a number of years ago who regularly had contact with a group of people who were intent on proving the content of the Bible from archaeology, and they were really invested in this. And one of them came into his office all excited, and he said, we are so thrilled, and I just want to come tell you that we have found Noah's Ark, or some part of Noah's Ark, which has been done before. And he said, but one strange thing that we can't figure out is the carbon dating. And he said, don't tell me. The carbon dating came back telling you that this object dated to somewhere between 300 and 600 AD. And he said, well, okay, yeah, how did you know that? And he said, because all of them date to that time. This was an ancient tourist site. And so in the Byzantine era, there were these replicas of biblical scenes built all over what we call the Holy Land today. And people in the ancient world made pilgrimage to these sites. So there was a Noah's Ark. You could find all these famous events represented. We still do that in some places. You all may have been to these things where you drive into something and you drive around and there are little statues or cutouts representing biblical scenes in some model of Noah's Ark or whatever. And they're obviously not the originals, but they're meant to give you some sense of, that story. But in the ancient world, it was done in a big way, and it was for ancient tourists. So anyway, we can't document any of this in Genesis 1 through 11 historically, thinking about ancient historians. These accounts are related, at least in a general way, to the myths of the ancient Near East. And while we often distance ourselves from that label and from the stories of Israel's neighbors, and for good reason, we don't want to think that our scripture is somehow in the same category as these stories from the pagan world that feature competing deities and so on. And in many ways, they don't fit that. Nevertheless, in some big ways, as stories about origins, stories about why we are what we are, foundational stories that connect heaven and earth and show the earthly realm to be directly impacted by the heavenly realm, the label fits. We shouldn't miss that. And as you know from your reading, there are a number of ancient stories that are parallels to the ones that we will be talking about. We'll also be highlighting some important differences, though, at once. The second way this label prehistory fits is that these first 11 chapters are the prelude to the story of Israel's ancestors. And the story of the ancestors, and I use the term ancestor here to refer to Abraham, Sarah, and their children, and so on. They appear more like history as a narrative. That is, we see them depicted as people, not as so much as types or as people who represent the first of something, but real people whose characters get filled out and in good and bad ways. So Genesis 12 and following tell us that family history, and sometimes Genesis 1 to 11 is seen as prelude to that and as somehow fundamentally different from that. I'm not sure that those who are putting these stories together, however, really thought that they were all that different. I think in their mind, they may have seen Genesis 1 through 11 as simply the introductory material that led right into the story of Abraham and Sarah. And so maybe Davis's label, primeval history, it's not unique to her, but primeval history may be more accurate. Regardless of that, one of the things that I think is important to note here is that the Old Testament is going to get us pretty quickly, when we get to chapter 12, into a family story and then to a national story, but that the Bible doesn't open with that is significant. Instead of Abraham and Sarah or the Exodus, it opens with the story of the creation of the world and of humankind, which includes all people everywhere. And so for that reason, I think it's important and theologically says something to us that we should keep in mind. It is, after all, the reason we are able to have a Gentile story, the openness to the Gentiles in the New Testament, go back to these stories. It goes back to Abraham, of course, as well. But to trace things back even before Abraham becomes important theologically for the arguments of the New Testament. Well, we're going to be talking about a number of stories that can be treated separately, but that fit together in an orderly way. So just think for a moment about the parts of the narrative that we'll be looking at. Genesis 1:1 to 2:3. Sometimes in the literature you will see it, and I will refer to it out of habit as 1:1 to 2:4a. Sometimes that first half of verse 4 is considered part of the first creation story. I think your life should not hinge on which one is right, but I'll use the designation that our textbook gives, 1:1 to 2:3. This is a story that comes from the priestly writer. We'll say more about that in just a moment. The second story, beginning right after that, 2:4. And going through 3:24, the story of the Garden of Eden, which includes a second creation story, is a story assigned to J. And I'm comfortable using that label still, although that doesn't tell us when it was written. As we said last time, that is very much up for grabs. It's something debated, where this used to be seen as the earliest story. Chapter 4, which in many ways is a continuation of chapter 3, but it also is by the Yahwist. We'll label that J as well. Then chapter 5 is one of those genealogies that you are probably tempted just to skip over quickly. It's usually assigned to J as well. Then the big block of material, chapter 6 to 9, the flood story. And it's a mix of J, E, and P as they're traditionally identified, if there is an E. So we'll go ahead and continue that designation. A mix of 2 or 3 sources. We looked at that a little bit last time, and you can really see it at places, the divisions of sources, especially in the repetition of the information about Noah His age is given at the beginning of the flood with different vocabulary. The animals coming onto the ark are listed more than one time, and at one point it's a pair of everything, and then it's 7 pairs, and they're divided into clean and unclean animals and so on. Chapter 10, known as the Table of Nations, is mainly a P document with some mix of J elements, as source critics usually divide this out. I put these up mainly to say, first, we do have these separate stories, but they fit together in a very orderly way. And so while we have repetition and overlap, the stories move from Genesis 1 through Genesis 10 in a way that you can kind of see a plot going on. And this is somewhat unique among the stories of the ancient world. Lots of stories that have parallels to those that we'll be looking at, but those in the Bible are rather unique in that they're put together into this one continuous narrative that makes sense, and then that is the prelude to this larger story of the nation. All right, well, let's take a look at a few of these. We'll dig in to 2 or 3 of them and give them some attention. So the first one, Genesis 1:1 to 2:3. The work of the priestly writer. This dates perhaps to the 6th century BCE, though as we said last time, that's still a question that we can't be absolutely certain about. What does seem to be the case is that the writer is familiar with and is perhaps even alluding to the Babylonian creation epic known as Enuma Elish. The Babylonian story features the god Marduk, who is the king of the pantheon of gods. He is declared king of the pantheon after a genealogy of the gods, something that by absence sets the Old Testament apart. The creator God of Genesis 1 is just the creator God and always has been. But in the Babylonian story, there is this genealogy of gods, and Marduk rises to the top, is declared king over them. And as king, he's appointed to go out to do battle over the forces of chaos, represented by a goddess named Tiamat. Tiamat is a monster who comes up out of the sea. I'll say more about that in a few moments. And Marduk goes to war with her, kills her, splits open her body, and from her body begins to create parts of the world. She has a partner, Kingu, who Marduk also kills, and from the blood of Kingu creates humankind. Now this sounds nothing like Genesis 1:1 to 2:3. But the series of events in creation are almost exactly parallel in the 2 stories. The Babylonians told their epic as part of their New Year celebration, the Kitu festival. And it was for, among other things, for the purpose of supporting the Babylonian monarchy in its conquest. So it's interesting how all stories like this have a political purpose and political role. So for the Babylonian monarchs, Marduk going out to battle against the forces of chaos is a legitimation of their going out to conquer peoples like the people of Judah, whomever, seen as signs of chaos out there in the hinterlands. And so they're empowered by Marduk to go out and do in real life in war what Marduk did in the narrative. Well, Genesis 1 is very different from that, and just to keep that story of the Babylonians in mind, I think helps us to know something of what Genesis 1:1 to 2:3 is trying to say about God, about humankind as well. So the story begins, first two verses, in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. That translation is perfectly fine in many ways, but I want to just point out a couple of things about what the Hebrew reads. Our translation reads these two verses as one continuous sentence, but they're actually two sentences in Hebrew. The first one read woodenly, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Very simple. So a couple of notes about that, and then we'll talk about the relationship between the two sentences. The first verb, bara, is a very important word to create. It's important because in the Old Testament, it only has God as its subject. But it doesn't mean what many people think it means. That is, following verse, the word create doesn't have anything to do with making stuff when there was nothing previously. Rather, it has to do with making order out of what is already there. The point of the word seems to be that things are disordered, but when God does this, create, bara, God puts it in order and gives it purpose. The second verse then begins with a conjunction that attached to a noun, which in Hebrew often signals a sentence that gives us the circumstances of what just went before. And so we might read it as a kind of parenthetical comment or an explanatory comment. Now, the earth was formless and void, that is, when God created. So NRSV is perfectly justified in combining them and starting the first one with a temporal reference. The two, though, clearly go together. And the second one gives us the circumstances and tells us that this creating is about God ordering things. When the NRSV translates toward the end of that second verse, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters, there is there again a little conjunction that I think might better be translated as an adversative. The earth was formless and void when God created, but a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. The word for wind translated here is the word ruach, that last consonant being a hard H sound, and it can be translated also spirit, or here wind, or breath. It will be rendered in all those ways at some point in the Old Testament. And it's somewhat ambiguous as to how we should see it here. Interesting to see the differences in translations. The NRSV as here translates wind. NIV translates spirit, and interestingly capitalizes the word. And so hints that this is talking about the Holy Spirit, that it sort of reads Christian theology into it, and some have questioned that how appropriate that is. but in RSV, wind is perfectly acceptable as well. But just to note that it's the same word, it's going to appear translated spirit in other places. The first thing God does then, it seems that with the wind blowing, beginning to change this disordered state, is to create light and to separate light from darkness. Verse 3. This is the one act of creation that I think is often overlooked, but is extremely important, at least was to ancient people. When we get to the plague narratives in the Exodus, we will note that all of these plagues, which are meant to get Pharaoh's attention, are signs that God is the creator, because Pharaoh thinks that he's in charge of the creation. We'll see how that message is sort of encoded in the book of Exodus in those first chapters. And so a number of things happen, as you know, from as God takes charge and as creation sort of rebels against Pharaoh. Plagues of frogs and flies, and the water source goes bad, and so on. The next to last plague, the one before the final blow, before life itself is snuffed out, is a return to darkness. And the reason for that is simply that it is thinking about God's power over creation and harking back to this story. Basically saying that, at least locally, it was only for the Egyptians, not for the Israelites, but for the Egyptians, the lights went out permanently as a way to convince Pharaoh he should finally pay attention. Well, notice that then verses 6 through 10, a larger block of material gives attention to the waters. Verse 6, God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate waters from waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome, and it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening, there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. This is beginning to fill out a picture of the structure of the creation that is quite different from the one we have. It sees, first of all, the dome that protects the earth. The earth is a kind of disk, and it has water around it and underneath it. And it has water above it. Did you notice that? Separate waters that are above from waters that are beneath. And then the waters that are beneath are separated out into seas so that dry land appears. When you read other texts like Psalm 104, and you read some of these other parallel passages to, particularly in the Psalms that talk about the creation, we see some other elements of conception of what this looked like. The earth isn't exactly floating on this water source. It's anchored by mountains. It seems to be the conception ancient Near Eastern people had. So the Babylonians left behind a world map, a little disc with commentary and a picture of the world. It's a little round disc that has Babylon at the center, shows the two great rivers of Babylon running through it. And around the perimeter are mountains that seem to be there to anchor the earth And you can see lots of ancient iconography that shows this. Psalm 104 speaks of the earth being founded on pillars. There's something that holds the earth in place. So the mountains do that, and for that reason, mountains are conceived as these most secure places. The Babylonian world map shows mountains all around. It's not two prominent ones or anything. This just seems to be the idea that when you come to these places that are elevated, the idea is there must be something underneath them as well, that goes down into that watery abyss that holds the earth in place. That those are the pillars of the earth. Yeah, that's a big question, and so one that anthropologists have explored. That ancient Near Eastern people seem to always think of sacred sites being located on mountains, and this may be one reason. Yeah, that they are seen as secure places in this sense. Although it's never explained anywhere, only that these are the places that sanctuaries are built, and God reveals things to humans and across cultures in this time and place. Well, so making dry land, the order begins to emerge. And so then in the verses that follow, parts of the creation begin to spring forth and give life. Just note the verbs here. You see them already. The verbs are not commands. The verbs are, grammarians will call them jussives. They're third-person verbs that are invitational, if you will. Let there be this or that. And when we get to verse 10, verse 11, the elements themselves become the objects of these verbs, become the subjects of these verbs. Let the earth put forth vegetation, verse 11, and the earth brought forth vegetation. Later, let the waters teem with life. The point is that unlike the Babylonian story where Marduk goes to war with these chaotic elements, in Genesis 1, God has no rival. And in fact, God invites the elements to participate in the making of order and the creation of life. And so they're part of the process. It's a very different picture of who God is. We can also note that God doesn't have rivals, but not only that, some of the elements that God is ordering seem to hint at a knowledge of the Babylonian story, particularly the word for the deep over in verse 2, it's Tahom, which sounds like Tiamat, the chaos monster from Enuma Elish. And yet here it's not personified, there's no rival deity, it's simply God putting things in place. So this, the tone of God's speech and the nature of God's actions seem to set God apart from Marduk, and that's a big deal. Well, we come to verse 26, the sixth day of creation, and that passage we looked at a number of class periods ago. Let's just dig in for a little bit more here. Verse 26, God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." And then it's followed by a narrative of God taking action. So God created humankind, in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. This is a very highly structured, tightly composed two sentences. And they're rather remarkable. First, God creates humankind. The word here is Adam, which is not a man's name. It's a designation for human beings in general.
So Adam.
God created Adam in God's image. Your textbook suggests as our image, which is a nuance that that is debated, but Davis here is treating the preposition. This is why you ought to all take Hebrew. Learn things can ride on how you interpret a preposition. I mean, it really can. And so it's the preposition just attached to any word potentially. And it's the use of it that is well known, the so-called bet essentia, not in our image, but as our image. I think it has a lot going for it, this interpretation. We'll say more about what that means in a moment. But notice the inclusiveness of it. God creates Adam in the divine image. And then verse 27 is careful to say, this includes male and female, both. When it reads, God created Adam, is the word, in his image. In the image of God, he created, and then there's a third masculine singular pronominal suffix here, created him. NRSV translates them because it's referring to Adam. Adam just happens to be a masculine noun. But that's, that's not natural gender. That's just every word is either masculine or feminine in Hebrew. And then following that, as if to clarify it, male and female, he created them. There have been some, like Karl Barth, who've tried with this passage to still see a hierarchy, but you really have to work pretty hard to see that. It's one of those places, as wonderful and brilliant as Barth was, I think he just missed it. This idea that all humankind is made in God's image then has at least two really important implications that are already here as part of this story. First, that every human being has worth, and I'm going to say more about that in just a moment. And the second thing is that every human being has capacity and or power, because being made in the divine image is defined, as it seems, as having dominion. You read Psalm 8 also, which for today, Psalm 8 is written with an awareness of Genesis 1 and probably also Genesis 2. And it directly links this dominion to this idea that humans are made in this particularly special way. As an expression of human worth, what's noteworthy here is that, Davis says, this is a slippery concept. It's not explained, and it's been debated, reflected on for 2,000 years, and that's right. The content of the image is hard to get our hands on, but there are a couple of things that we can say for sure here that everybody recognizes who studies these texts. First of all, here Adam is being presented with a high view of Adam, I should say, as compared to the Mesopotamian story, which has humans being made basically as the servants to do the grunt work of the gods. That's not what humans are doing here in this story. And second, The word here is selim, a word that means often statue. It's used, for example, in 2 Kings 11:18 to refer to a statue of the Canaanite god Baal, a physical representation. Kings in the ancient Near East would put images of themselves in their territories that they had conquered, as a way of reminding anyone who wondered, should I claim this territory, that no, the god of Assyria, the king of Assyria, or the king of Babylon, whomever it happened to be, has claimed this, has conquered it, and here's the evidence. We have a little statue, of the king with some inscription or something like that to remind everybody. So the idea here may be that humans are the representation of God on earth as those who stand in for God in the creation. I think what's really important is that Israel's neighbors sometimes use this language, particularly the Egyptians used it more than anybody else, but the Mesopotamians did as well. But in both of those places, it was only the king who was made in the image of the deity. Everyone else fell underneath. So, sort of remarkable that here, all human beings are made in the divine image. So this is going to be one of the main points of the Berman book, that he sees it filled out in other ways in the Torah. And so we'll look to see how that works. But this has not been lost on people through the ages. So Thomas Paine, when he was arguing for the creation of democracy, and democracy assumes that all people have equal worth and very different from monarchies, Paine points back to this story, and he talks about it as a historical referent. He said we can see it in numerous places, but the earliest is in this ancient history. It goes all the way back to the very beginning. He talks about it not quite as scripture, but as history. But it's interesting that he's linking the creation of democracy to this story and to this pronouncement. Well, as we think about what this means, and we can't spend time on this, but this is something just for our reflection going forward. I think we have to wonder then what it means to live as those made in the divine image in what Davis calls the Anthropocene, which is usually a term referring to the time from the Industrial Revolution on. The misuse of this idea, has been something many have noted. Most famously, Lynn White in an essay in the late 1960s, who sort of blames the ecological crisis on this passage and this concept, not so much on the passage itself, but on the way it's been used. And people even quite recently. Well, Genesis 2:4 to 3:24. Separate creation story, but it's put together with the first creation story for a purpose. I mean, it doesn't tell us why, but it seems obvious that that's the case. I think that in itself is important to recognize. The old source critics wanted to make such a point, and a lot of students of these texts, when they first discovered this, that we have two creation stories, wanted so much to recognize that fact that they lost, that they go together. They do. We need to hold both of those together at the same time. It's linked to the first creation story, but when was it written? And that is sort of up for grabs, as you know from our discussion last time. But it seems that this second story, among other things, fills out the idea of what it means to be made in the divine image. It's a very different story, though, and you can read the second story as standing in great contrast to the first. In some ways, it's helpful to see that, but at the same time, to put them back together. So, for example, the second story begins with the creation of humankind, and then talks about the making of everything else, animals, all the plants of the earth, and so on. Here also, God is not speaking, but God is forming. And it seems the picture of God, which in this second story is anthropomorphic, is of God as a potter. God, let me erase a couple of these terms. I'll put one of them back up in just a moment. God forms Adam, the same term used again, from the dust of the ground. And the word for ground is Adamah. So this little play on words is important here. Humans formed as objects from the ground, and then there's a two-part creation event. God forms the human being, and then God breathes into Adam the breath of life. Now, one question about this is at the beginning, when God forms Adam and breathes into Adam the breath of life, that word is being used. As I said, this is a masculine noun, but is Adam at the beginning intended to be a male? And it's not as obvious as it may seem. Eventually, Adam later on will be used as a proper name. And it seems that this one created first will be considered a male figure, but it's not completely obvious. So let's look a little bit further, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. God proceeds then to create other beings. And as God makes the animals, it says that God is searching for a helper. The word here is ezer in Hebrew, for the man, which is not a derogatory term and not a term of subordination at all. As many point out, the main referent for that word in the Old Testament is God. The psalmist often cries out, "Oh God, my etzer, my helper." That's who God is. So the term doesn't carry any of those negative connotations or terms related to hierarchy or anything like that. But a partner, a companion for the Adam is being sought out. None of the animals work. So the Adam has named the animals and they've gone off, and none of them are found a suitable etzer. So then God causes the man to fall into a deep sleep, and God takes what? It takes from the Adam's side. The word here does not mean rib. It simply means side. And it's a word that sometimes is used to refer to the side of a hill, the side of a ship, and so on. So what is it that God is doing? It's just not completely clear. So there are two interpretations of this. The old traditional one, rib, may be right. There's another kind of interesting interpretation. that I don't know is right, but it's really interesting. If you take seriously this sort of ambiguous word side, you could take that what's going on here is that God is splitting the Adam in half and creating a second being that is the mirror image of the first. I don't know if that's right or not, but the interpretation has been used by a number of biblical scholars and theologians, interestingly ranging from feminist to far right figures, and for very different reasons. Some feminists, namely Phyllis Tribble, have argued for this interpretation, and Tribble is an Old Testament scholar, have argued for this interpretation as a way of seeing a kind of radical equality in the passage. And there are signs of really kind of radical equality in both of these creation stories as they present God's intention for things that will go awry eventually. And then there are others who take it as meaning this because they want to see that male and female are complementary and go together in ways that two men can't go together and so on. That's what people on the right have sometimes done with it. I don't know if this interpretation is right or not, but it's kind of interesting to think about. And at least it is possible that that's what's happening here. Well, what we can say is, of course, when the second being split off for the first is brought to Adam, then we have this differentiation, and we start to have gendered language. So now we have the first being called Ish, a word that it's not a word for gender per se. It's more a word that refers to social roles. So it may be man, but it's also a word that can mean husband. Like if you study German, the German word Mann, which can mean male, or it can mean husband, or any number of other things. And the other word is the feminine equivalent, Isha, which can mean woman or wife. And the little etiology that the Yahwist gives is, she's the second, she is called Isha because she's taken out of Ish. And this part of the story may be justification for that traditional interpretation that indeed we have one being, part of the being is taken to form the second, and the first one, at least in the end, is considered the male figure, the second, the female figure. But the proclamation is, this at last is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. This is kinship language. The Isha is kin to Ish in a way that the animals are not. And then we have a little, at the end of chapter 2, a little etiology of marriage. A man, for this reason, says, a man leaves father and mother and clings to his wife. None of that has happened yet. There's no father or mother. So it's interesting that it's inserted here. It's also a kind of curious statement because in Israelite society, this isn't the way it seemed to have worked. Rather, it's the woman leaves father and mother and goes to live with the man's family. And in this patriarchal society, everything is organized around what's sometimes called the Beit Av, the house of the father, household of the father. And so when sons marry, they bring their wives and they become part of this larger family. So why state it this way? It's really impossible to know. Some have proposed that what's going on here is one of those statements that recognizes the primary relationship between the man and woman as a distinct family unit, and a kind of charge to the man whose wife is taken out of her family context and brought into his. She's the one who's vulnerable. She's the one who could potentially suffer abuse and so on, be disregarded. But he is to make sure that doesn't happen, because he's to leave father and mother emotionally, perhaps, and cling to the wife. Well, that's all speculation, but it's an interesting statement that it's worded the opposite of what the normal practice is. So something's going on there. This leads into then the Eden story. And, the story that becomes so central to the Christian faith. I say it that way because it doesn't get any more attention in the Old Testament. Nowhere after this, is this ever mentioned. No one ever brings up the temptation in the garden and what that's caused. So kind of curious that it doesn't happen. The serpent appears to the woman, and the issue is there are these two trees in the middle of the garden. The tree of life, which doesn't get much attention. The one that becomes central is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they're not to eat of this tree. But the serpent comes and questions the woman. So a couple of things about this serpent. It's simply said when the story begins that he was more crafty than the other wild animals the Lord God had made, which is not necessarily a negative judgment, simply an observation. But he talks. He's not quite like any of the other animals. We don't know about any of the others talking. And so eventually we'll have a little etiology of the serpent and why he crawls on his belly. Presumably he's walking on legs here and not crawling around, and that becomes part of the curse on him, and he stops talking at some point as well. But he is in this story only a serpent. It will become later in Christian reflection this question of where did evil come from and who was this serpent? So in the pseudepigrapha, in the life of Adam and Eve, we begin to get an explanation of it. This is a first century document. The life of Adam and Eve, we have an explanation for this. The serpent is in fact a fallen angel, we learned there. Well, this is how he's explained. And he is upset as he explains what happened in the garden, tells Adam all this, explains that when humans were created, all the angels were called together. Now, there's no mention of angels here, by the way, not yet. But as God speaks in the plural, as we noted a few class meetings ago, there's this understanding there are some around God's throne. There's someone there. God calls the angels together and orders them to bow down to the humans who are made in the divine image. And the angel represented by the serpent says to Adam, I didn't want to have any part of this, and is offended by it. And so sets out with that to tempt humans, to ruin things for them. And so the beginning of temptation and evil is explained that way in this later document. There's no hint of any of that in the story itself, but this is the kind of reflection that goes on and that becomes just a kind of standard part of Christian thought later on. Well, you know the rest of the story. They take the fruit, the woman first, and then the man. And it doesn't seem to be done, by the way, for all the negative press that Eve will get at some point. It doesn't seem to be done without Adam's knowledge, because it simply says she gives him some of it. Her husband, who was with her, he seems to have been standing there all along. But so maybe she was the one who was in charge in the garden, and he's just a bystander. But it's kind of hard to tell. But this later reflection becomes really important. As a result of that, they lose their chance at immortality, perhaps. This is one of the great mysteries, is what was intended here at the beginning about this. Are they from the beginning intended to live forever? Did they have the potential merely for living forever if they ate of the tree of life? Maybe. There's a James Barr 20 years ago or so wrote a book about this story, and he thinks that this is a story about the potential for immortality that humans lost, that's the background. It's just not clear what is intended here, but they lose the opportunity to eat from this tree, cast out of the garden. Then things begin to turn even worse. Chapter 4, the two children are born, Cain and Abel, and they have their two vocations, one being a farmer, one being a shepherd. The shepherd, Abel, brings the best of his flock, and priestly sacrificial language is used here. He brings from his flock to be sacrificed, the fat of the inner being, as it was supposed to be. Just like in the flood story, you have sacrifices going on. That's the J rider, right, presenting Noah making a sacrifice, because for J, sacrifice goes on from the very beginning, whereas for P, it starts at Sinai. Okay. You get regulations about sacrifice and so on. So both know sacrifice and so on, but they're thinking of them differently in terms of their origins.
Got it. Thanks.
They both bring an offering. God. It doesn't even say God rejects Abel's offering. It simply says God does not regard it, notice it. And so, as you know, Cain kills Abel. Then this really interesting sign of grace. By the way, there was, when Adam and Eve are sent out of the garden, there's another, and there's signs of grace all along here. There's one there that's really subtle in chapter 3, verse 22, where they've tried to cover themselves with fig leaves, which fig leaves are not a great covering for our bodies, but also probably rather uncomfortable. And it says that God makes coverings of skin for them, which may or may not mean that God killed animals. That's not addressed at all. But that God covers them, is one of those little things in the text that says God is making up for their inadequacies from the very start. Well, here God says the ground is cursed, or you are cursed from the ground is the expression. The ground is no longer going to cooperate with you. Notice that here, the ground itself is a character in the story. I mean, Adam was made from Adamah. Adam was put in the garden to serve it. The verb translated till is avad, to serve, and to keep. Two words that we might, if we're addressing ecological issues, rightly point out have to do with caretaking and so on, and not abusing. But Cain's role is as one who serves the ground. The ground responds by producing fruit, produce, or the word is its strength. It produces what shows its vitality. And this is no longer going to be the case. The ground is not going to cooperate. So the ground has cried out because the blood of his brother fell upon it, cried out against Cain. The ground will now rebel against Cain. So what will he do? He is destined then to wander upon the earth. And he says, and for some reason that's not clear from the context, well, when people see me, they'll kill me. So who are these other people who are going to see him? You know, that's not clear, but the Yahwist is assuming now there are other people out there. But the answer is, God says, I'm going to put a mark on you. The word here in Hebrew, oath, it's not at all a clear term. Oath, mark, sign, we don't know what that is. But I hope you found interesting the reading in Hayasha Jr.'s article. It's interesting the way people have thought about the mark of Cain. And so in white supremacist circles, this has been interpreted as dark skin. And I can remember hearing that as a child and even thinking then, you know, well, what keeps us from thinking it's the opposite, you know? And her article is just this wonderful recollection of how African-American preachers saw it exactly the opposite. And, you know, that, and using that old expression scared so much that one turned white, you know. That's the mark of Cain. God approached him and it terrified him so much that his skin turned white. And that was the beginning. So it's one of those things that is ambiguous. It's some kind of sign. Is it a tattoo, a distinctive mark? What is this? It's not at all clear. But this is the start of the downfall of everything. The first violent act, although the word violence is not used at that point, but it will be used beginning in chapter 6. So chapter 6 through 9, then the story of the flood shows this downward spiral of the whole creation. The first 4 verses of chapter 6 are, I'm assuming, probably verses you all don't pay that much attention to theologically if you're like most people, but this was very, very important for early Christian reflection. This idea that when daughters were born, the sons of God, angels, saw they were fair and took wives for themselves, and they had children. And early Christian sources, and well, pre-Christian sources for that matter, first Enoch being the primary one, saw this as the beginning of the evil spirits that would be in league with Satan, and goes to great length talking about it. Sure, the children that are born are seen as the evil spirits that come, that proliferate on earth. It's fascinating reading. I mentioned the life of Adam and Eve earlier, and first Enoch. These are texts that try to explain things that these Old Testament texts don't even address at all. They just state things that raise all kinds of questions. Who are these Nephilim? They come up a number of times in the Old Testament. And they're seen as the personification of these evil spirits on earth. Well, this begins this downward spiral into violence. And there are a couple of different explanations for why God is going to have to destroy everything. Genesis 6:1-4 is one prelude to that. Then verse 5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to the heart. And so what God does is essentially reverse the creation. The story of the flood is, as we said before, especially as you look at the P parts of it, not just hard rain, but a reversal of creation. The windows of the heavens are open, so this dome that's above, the windows that would open up and let the water source above water the earth and then close up, they open up and don't close at all. And the water that's under the earth just is allowed to erupt onto the earth itself. The springs of the great deep burst forth. All that's been holding the waters back comes undone. God remembers Noah, who has preserved his family and the animals on the ark. And then there's this really important statement in chapter 8, verse 22. When the flood ends, and we'll read verses 20-22. Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind. For the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. The statement God makes after the flood and in response to Noah's sacrifice harks back to that statement about the reason for the flood in the first place. The inclination of the human heart is only evil continually. It's almost exactly word for word the same. What's, I think, important is that NRSV translates as though one idea follows from another. That is, that God's not going to destroy the earth because the inclination of the human heart is only evil continually. In Hebrew there's a little particle pronounced ki that can be, and here I think should be understood as a concessive, even though the inclination of the human heart is only evil continually. And this is another really profound statement about God's grace. Essentially, at the end of the flood, what God says is, humans have learned nothing from this. So God decides simply to be more gracious and to be more forbearing. And therefore, then the promise that there will not be this destruction by floodwaters again. Chapter 9 then tells us this covenant God makes with Noah. And the priestly writer, as we said before, marks these special occasions with covenants. The covenant with Noah is the first of these here. And the sign of the covenant is the bow in the clouds. We'll see other covenants come later and signs of those covenants as well. Chapter 10 tells us then in the genealogy of Noah's sons, the table of nations, mostly a P document again, how Shem, Ham, and Japheth give birth to children, and they scatter across the earth. They're all in different places. And just raise a question here for you all as you work on your passages, Genesis 11, 1-9. How does that fit in? When it seems that chapter 10 says that humans scatter across the earth and speak different languages. They're in different places. And then suddenly in 11, it's not so. Well, you'll find plenty of reflection on that and scholars trying to answer that question. After the Table of Nations, we have, or I should say after the Babel story, another genealogy comes in that basically picks up from the genealogy of chapter 5 and gives us the genealogy of Shem that will lead us down to the family of Abram. So this prehistory is linked to the family history of Abraham. He will be the father of, not Abraham, but Seth will be the father of Eber, a name that reflects the Hebrews. And it's from that group that Abraham comes and the national story, which is largely a story of God as God starts over, identifying this one family and then trying to go back to the promises of creation and to re-up them through Abraham and Sarah. And so we'll take up there. Oh, well, it doesn't say, does it?
Okay, clearly doesn't say. Okay.
The point is simply that this mixing of the angels with humans is not to be done. The angels have overstepped their bounds, you know, study of angels is an interesting thing. Some think that angels have no possibility for disobedience, but they're not called angels. They're called the sons of God.
Oh,
but they clearly do something here that they're not supposed to do. They step out of the divine realm and enter into oh, good question. So I don't think the word dualism is usually means that there's a force of evil that opposes the force that opposes God. And so God has competition. We really see no hint of that. So there is from the start the possibility of evil in the world, but the evil comes from the humans themselves. It's a story that reflects kind of the beginning of the emergence from childhood. They're in this childlike state. They're not aware of good and evil. Suddenly they become aware. That seems to be what it's drawing from. You know, that moment when, when do we know that? It's pretty early on. But we live at some point early in our lives with this blissful ignorance of anything good and evil. And then suddenly we're aware that we can make decisions, that we can disobey, that we can be untruthful, and and I think it's just mirroring that. So if you want to call that dualism, that's fine, but it's not dualism in the sense that there's competition for God, in the divine realm. Again, these are stories that tell us at the deepest level, why is it we do what we do? Why are we even aware that there's something other than good? Well, it's really, why do we have knowledge? Because once we have knowledge, we see good and evil. It's not one or the other. When you have this awareness, so it's something to have that is to leave childhood, is to leave infancy, And so it seems to address that. Why not just this blissful state? There's also lots of reflection in the pseudepigraphical literature about what was the relationship between Adam and Eve too. So a lot of people think they're a couple, And some say, no, that couldn't be because they have no awareness of anything like that. That only comes later. And these debates about when they had sexual relations, was it related to this knowledge or not, and on and on. Lots of questions about that are prompted by these stories, but the stories themselves don't address at all, don't even start to talk about